Good afternoon, everyone. We're really excited to be here. My name is Tait.
My name's Gus, and we are Future Crunch.
And we're here with our really good friend, Will Tait.
So, we should probably be clear that despite the name and the picture, we're not fortune tellers about the future.
We do, however, love to talk about the future. And we love nerding out about it. But with Gus being a political economist and me being a cancer researcher, we don't always agree on how it looks.
We're not Australian, as you might be able to tell from the accents. I'm South African, Tane is American, and Will? British.
But we do live in Melbourne. Yes, we have beards, but we're not hipsters that ride fixies and have tattoos.
Despite what many people think to the contrary, we're not a couple.
But we are great friends, and we love nerding out about science and technology. In fact, we think science is fucking amazing. We can take photos of Pluto, unravel quantum mechanics, and even cut and paste our own DNA. It's the basis of so many of the material comforts that we often take for granted. Contact lenses, sex toys, painkillers, and cheap plastic raincoats. It is the foundation of the technology upon which we rely. Electricity, GPS, cancer therapies, touchscreens, and the internet. But science is more than that. As Carl Sagan said, it's a way of thinking. It's the best means that we have to understand and describe the world around us. And unlike ideology, science allows for correction. It constantly evolves. Given one contrary piece of information, it insists that we rethink everything we once knew. And that's why science is awesome. And it's true, whether you believe it or not.
We love science because it gives us a sense of perspective through the discovery of the very small or the very big, the very old or the very distant. And perhaps most importantly, it gives us stories about the world around us and stories about ourselves, stories of human determination and ingenuity, driven by our desire to discover the truth and our capacity for curiosity and wonder. But of course, there are many stories out there. And science isn't even a particularly popular one, especially in Australia. Instead, the story that we like to tell ourselves most often looks a little bit more like this.
You here. There's been a shooting in France. Casualties are being reported at the French satirical weekly Charlie Hebdo.
Thousands of Icelanders took to the streets calling on the Prime Minister to resign.
Step over the bodies of many of those less fortunate.
The impact on the ground was not survivable.
On the Ebola crisis, as that patient in Dallas struggles right now.
We have a financial crisis.
There are live pictures now.
Bomb them! I would bomb the shit out of them.
There's no convincing scientific evidence for man-made climate change.
With the media screaming bloody murder and our social media feeds filled with abhorrent stories of our fellow human beings, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the world is going to hell in a handbasket. But you'd be wrong.
Because as Franklin Roosevelt once said, the mark of our progress is not whether we add to the abundance of those who have too much, it is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. And if we use that as our criteria, then there is another story out there, one backed by science, that tells us something very different.
In September last year, the World Bank announced that the number of people living in poverty has dropped to an historic low, 9.6% of the global population.
Contrary to popular belief, global inequality is coming down too. In the last 20 years, China has pulled off the single biggest transfer of global wealth to the poor in human history. In Latin America, every single country has gotten richer while seeing drops in income inequality, and the same is true for many African countries. The world now contains a robust middle class that accounts for 40% of the global labor force.
Quality of life is improving. Last year, 91% of the world had access to improved water supplies. That's up from 76% in 1990. And during the same time, 1.9 billion people gained access to electricity. And, thanks to better preparedness, less people die from natural disasters than at any other time in history.
The world is getting less violent too. Murder rates have come down in 66 out of the 82 countries for which data is available in the last decade. And 2016 is turning out to be a great year for world peace. Yep, you heard that right. Following the end of conflict in Colombia, all of the war in the world is now contained to an arc stretching from Nigeria through to Pakistan that contains less than a sixth of the world's population. And within that arc, things are getting better too. In Nigeria, Boko Haram is on the retreat in most of its home territories. In South Sudan and the Central African Republic, new governments have brought hope for lasting peace. In Syria and the Ukraine, ceasefires are holding despite occasional flare-ups. And in Pakistan, the murder rates are coming down and violence is coming down, something that's abated over the last few years. We now live in a world that's much safer than at any other point in human history. You'll often hear military leaders say, "We live in the most dangerous times ever." In statistical terms, that's complete bullshit.
What about war's fellow horsemen of the apocalypse, famine and pestilence? In the last 25 years, we have brought 200 million people out of hunger.
We're on the verge of eradicating one of the most horrible diseases of all time, polio. Since the beginning of this year, only 16 new cases have been reported in Afghanistan and Pakistan, the last two places on Earth where this disease exists in the wild.
We're also winning the war on AIDS. We're seeing a steady decline in the amount of infections. And UNAIDS reckons that they will cease the last new infection by 2030.
And we're winning the war on the world's deadliest infectious disease, malaria. Thanks to the rollout of nets and new vaccines, malaria deaths have come down by almost half since the beginning of the century.
And a result of treating these preventable diseases, since 1990, we have halved the child mortality rate. That means since 2000 alone, we have saved the lives of 48 million children. That is the most astonishing news story, yet we just don't hear about it in the popular media. And the lives of these children are improving too. In April last year, UNESCO announced that now 9 out of 10 children around the world are learning to read and write. That's up from 5 out of 10 in the 1970s.
Civil and political tolerance also continue their stuttering spread. In the last 12 months, we've seen peaceful and democratic transitions of power in Myanmar, Burkina Faso, Argentina, Tanzania, and the Central African Republic, all formerly authoritarian regimes. In Saudi Arabia in December last year, women received the right to vote in local elections for the first time. And in 2015, for the first time ever, more than half of the world's countries have now made the death penalty illegal. That is a huge milestone for our species.
Now, that's all fine and dandy for human beings, but what about the natural world? Well, it's not all bad news there either. Forests are regenerating in US, Europe, and Asia. China has spent $21 billion over the last 18 years on the most successful and the largest conservation effort of all time.
In the last 12 months, endangered species such as the panda, the snow leopard, and the mountain gorilla have all seen increases in their wild populations. Other species like the grizzly bear, the black bear, the peregrine falcon, the sea turtle, and the manatee have all been taken off the endangered list. Overfishing is coming down in the United States and Europe thanks to better regulations. In the Connecticut River, wild salmon are spawning for the first time since the American Revolution. Whale populations are exploding around the world thanks to decades of sustained campaigning by conservationists and continued pressure on outliers like Norway and Japan. In Europe, bears, lynx, wolves, and wolverines are all returning in droves.
And in early April, we heard that the number of tigers in the wild has increased for the first time in 100 years. These are some of the great unsung environmental stories of our time. They show us what can be done. They really should be celebrated.
So, we should kind of point out here, we are not saying that the world is a perfect place. Many things are going wrong for humanity. We've heard a lot about them. Climate change, continued environmental degradation, forced migration, political and religious extremism, and a global elite that doesn't care about the rest of us. And it's also true that this surge of progress hasn't reached everyone. Far too many people still live in extreme poverty. 6 million children still die every year unnecessarily of preventable diseases. And hundreds of millions of people cannot access the basic freedoms which we all take for granted. However, you have to be able to hold two ideas in your head at once. The world is getting better, and the world is not yet good enough. Our successes in the past should give us confidence moving forward into the future.
So, why do so many of these positive news stories come as such a surprise to us? Well, neuroscience gives us some insight. The alarm bell of our brain, a small bundle of nerves called the amygdala, uses about 2/3 of its nerves essentially to look for bad news. It's primed to go negative. When we see something dangerous or scary, it overrides all other higher functioning parts of our brain. This is known as the amygdala hijack, and it's why your feet are already moving before you realize that it's a crocodile jumping out of the water at you. To make things even worse, we have what's known as negativity bias. It's the psychological phenomenon by which negative and scary experiences instantly go into our long-term memory, where positive experiences need a much longer exposure to sink in. Really, in effect, our brain is like Velcro for negative experiences and like Teflon for positive ones.
Unfortunately, in today's world, the biggest threat isn't predators with teeth like it was for our ancestors, it's predators with cameras. Because the media knows that you have evolutionary hangovers, and they use it to sell you stuff. In a 2012 study at the University of Michigan, they showed that when we read bad news, it actually has a physiological effect on us. Our heart rate goes up and our sweat output increases. And in a follow-up study in 2014, they showed that when people were presented with good and bad news, they lingered far longer on the bad news headlines.
To make things even more complex, we have what's known as confirmation bias, which is our tendency to actively seek out information that confirms our pre-existing notions. This won Daniel Kahneman the Nobel Prize in 2002.
So the whole thing kind of operates as this really horrible negative feedback loop. The media pushes bad news at us because they know it's going to sell, and then that makes us feel really negative about the world. And so we go out looking for news that confirms that notion. And of course, there's plenty of it out there, available on skynews.com, iPad, iPhone, and Sky Go. And so the whole cycle starts again. You might have heard the expression, if it bleeds, it leads. That's not a colloquialism coined by some cutthroat tabloid editor. It is a potent evolutionary truth that lies at the heart of the modern day commercial media machine.
That's why Ebola makes headlines, when bad doctor's handwriting does not, even though it kills the same amount of people. It's why everyone is freaking out about terrorism, but no one's announcing a press conference to talk about the more damaging phenomenon of mental health disorders. It's why policemen and firemen are celebrated, but nurses are not, even though they save more lives. And the reason they can save more lives is because they can read bad doctors' handwriting.
And then there are the politicians. On the right, they emphasize threats such as crime, terrorism, and immigration. And on the left, they tell us that capitalism is predatory and that bankers are the devil. And the environmentalists tell us that the oceans are burning and that the forests are dying and that we're all on a collision course with a climate change time bomb.
But the problem with this fear-based rhetoric, which dominates modern-day media and politics, is that while it may galvanize a few people into action, for the vast majority of us, it breeds cynicism, apathy, hopelessness, and even hate. And when we share these bad stories, we transmit those emotions to others. The scariest epidemic of today isn't Zika or AIDS or the next superbug. It's fearmongering. And every time we rant at a dinner table or take to social media and complain, we spread it.
We have a choice about the stories that we tell each other and about the stories that we share. We should be preparing for a world in which things are getting better. And the more people that start believing that that world is possible, the sooner we can start taking action. Optimism isn't naive. It's one of the best means that we have for creating engagement and activity.
So we're at a conference with culture, entrepreneurship, and technology. Why the hell are we talking about neuroscience, nurses, Ebola, and Donald Trump? We came here today to tell you a different story about the world that we live in. And that story is often hard to tell. It involves things that aren't very sexy, like economics, governance, institutions, and statistics.
But the story also involves science and technology, and for us, those stories are sexy. And the reason we love technology in particular is because it makes goods and services available to a proportion of the world's population that didn't have access to them before.
And those are the stories that we love to tell, about hundreds and thousands of our fellow human beings using technology to create, to innovate, and drive social change. So we've already told you a story about the world, and perhaps it's a little bit better than you once thought. Now, for the second part of the talk, we would like to invite you on a little journey as we describe the world and how it could be getting even better.
So the first story we really want to tell here is a story that all of you are very familiar with, the story of the mobile internet, the quickest and biggest technology uptake of all time. It means that people like Nanasaheb Shirsat, an Indian street food vendor, can now take pictures of their freshly made wares in the morning and send it to WhatsApp groups with hundreds of their customers. That provides him with free marketing. It's helped him turn his life around from being a scrap vendor of steel into having one of the best-known food stalls in Bangalore.
In Saudi Arabia, when women were first allowed to vote last year, it was still illegal for them to drive. That's why women's rights organizations teamed up with Uber to get them to the polls for free. And in Iran, morality police patrol the streets and make sure that you're wearing your burqa and not too much makeup. So a group of young Iranians coded an app that allowed you to put the GPS checkpoints of these locations so you can avoid them.
In Brazil, this group of students coded an app that allows you to speak in Portuguese into your phone and then show that in sign language with an avatar. That app's been downloaded 400,000 times by hearing impaired people.
The language barriers are coming down in even more profound ways. Last week marked the launch of an Indiegogo project of an in-ear instant translation device called Pilot. That means you can speak in any language to someone with a phone and they can understand you in real time.
We're moving into a world where everyone's connected and everyone can understand each other. That's a world where people like Caxme, an Ivory Coast amputee, can become an Instagram fashion superstar.
In Kazakhstan, Alexandria Elbakyan, a 28-year-old science researcher, has made 48 million scientific articles free online. They're calling her the Robin Hood of science. Her site, Sci-Hub, now has millions of people accessing it from developing countries who couldn't previously access these articles and didn't have the money for expensive journal subscriptions.
In Nigeria, Osine and Onesi Ikianosime, two Nigerian kids aged 12 and 14, have never lived in a world without the internet. They decided that Google Chrome sucked, so they learned how to code on their mobile phones and they built a new browser. And in this new world, we're exchanging value in new ways too. Since 2011, thanks to mobile money, 700 million people have gained access to finance. In countries like Somalia and Kenya, more people now use their phones to do banking than traditional banking. And in Geneva, what we're starting to see, well, this is a photo from Geneva, but as we start moving into this new world, we're also seeing the evolution of our devices. As you heard this morning, new types of digital experiences are becoming available to us. This is a photo from Geneva, where what they're doing is they're giving diplomats headsets and then allowing them to walk through the ruins in Syria before they go into negotiations.
Virtual reality apps are being made for kids with autism. who allow them to go into a virtual world and begin to learn subtle nonverbal cues, allowing them to better integrate with society.
In Florida, NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory is using augmented and mixed reality to help them design the next Mars rover for the 2020 Mars mission.
So technology is becoming ambient. It's fading into the background, into the walls, into the furniture, and into our clothing. It's shrinking in form and expanding in function. It's being built to be calmer and quieter, to preserve our relationships and our mindfulness, rather than just grab our attention. As we begin to understand that creative focus is the only thing that can't be automated. When you think of the future, think of ancient Greece, not Blade Runner, a world of instant connection dominated by ideas, not tools.
And in that new world, things aren't just changing digitally, we're actually changing our physical environment. 3D printing now allows us to create everything from jet engines through to cars. We can use recycled materials. In Germany, they're printing shoes from recovered ocean plastic nets and ocean plastic itself. In China, they're using industrial and agricultural waste slurry to 3D print houses like the one in this picture.
We can even print tissue, organs, and human skin, which they're using for pharmacological and cosmetic testing, which is great news for our furry little friends, because it can mean the end of animal testing.
In Sudan, people like Daniel Ko and his friend Kibaki can now have 3D prosthetics printed for them for the cost of $10 or $15 of plastic, because the schematic can be freely downloaded online.
Meanwhile, in Rwanda, drones are being used to deliver blood to remote locations to decrease maternal deaths due to postpartum hemorrhaging. In Bolivia, remote forest tribes are using drones to monitor illegal logging in their lands. And in Nepal and the Philippines, after natural disasters, several humanitarian organizations use drones for search and rescue and for reconstruction efforts.
What about energy? Well, developing countries already understand that building a low-carbon economy is the only viable way that a future is going to come. In China last year, they added more renewables than the entire existing combined capacity of US, UK, and France. In India, they're building the world's largest solar PV plant. In Morocco, they're building the world's largest solar concentrating plant. In South Africa, my home country, investments in renewables are up by 327%. Latin America is now the fastest growing market for solar in the world.
And this stuff is really starting to bite. Finally, in the last 2 years, global carbon emissions have flatlined, while we've seen an increase in global GDP. That is a huge blow to the fossil fuel lobbyists who push the propaganda that we need fossil fuels for economic development. And these technologies are getting better all the time. Modern wind turbines are marvels of human ingenuity and engineering savvy. They have twice the capacity and generate 4 times the amount of electricity than they did just 7 years ago. With solar, we're using new and improved materials like perovskite, invented here in Australia, which is drastically improving efficiency. And we can now install it into clear glass. Now imagine a city like Sydney with every window in every skyscraper an energy-producing cell. Then you realize that cities themselves can be their own power plants.
Technology improves healthcare as well. This is Helen Lee, a British researcher, and she's invented a machine called the Samba. It's a genetic sequencing machine that allows them to diagnose AIDS 10 times cheaper and 20 times faster than existing techniques. It's already been used 40,000 times in remote parts of the world.
In Japan, stem cell breakthroughs have allowed researchers to restore sight in someone who was previously blind.
In 2012, 2 biologists, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, invented a technology called CRISPR-Cas9, which allows us to literally cut and paste our own DNA. That technology has already been used to save the lives of toddlers like Layla Richards from leukemia. We've already made cells in human bodies impervious to AIDS. And bioengineers are engineering mosquitoes to turn them into vaccine distributors when they get released into the wild. That's going to be a key technology in our fight against Zika and malaria.
And in Australia, they've invented something called the bionic spine at the University of Melbourne, which is an implantable device that allows you to control your prosthetic limbs. Les Bao, last year in December, became the first person to use machine-to-brain interfacing to move his twin prosthetics with only the power of his mind.
And we're finally starting to think about aging as a disease, thanks to our control over the basic biological processes of life. A few weeks ago, researchers announced the trials of a new drug called rapamycin, which is the first anti-aging drug in dogs. And they've already been shown to extend the lifespans of mice by up to 35% by removing old and worn-out cells. This kind of blows our mind a little bit. But for every 24 hours that we currently live, we gain 6 hours of life expectancy. So, while the two of us have been up here rambling on, everyone in this audience has gained 6 minutes of life expectancy.
Okay, let's wrap things up. Today we came here to tell you a story about the world, showing that it's fairer, healthier, cleaner, and more abundant. We've shown you the immense progress that humanity has made in the past 20 years and suggested that if we work together and use a combination of science and technology, we can make it even better in the next 20.
So, what does that mean for you? Well, start educating yourself. Get out there and engage with this material. You have the greatest information resource humanity has ever known at your fingertips. If you're looking for places to start and you don't know where to go, can we suggest subscribing to our newsletter? It comes out once every fortnight. Apologies to Reggie Watts. And it's packed full of awesome stories about how science and technology are making the world a better place. While you're at it, stop listening to the mainstream media. Understand that they've got a commercial logic that's predicated on fear and inaccurate perceptions of risk, and they're distorting our view of the world. And stop sharing bad news. Every time you rant at a dinner party or you share bad news on social media, you act as a disease vector for fear.
Let's cultivate an attitude of optimism. Now, remember, cynicism is easy. You're never wrong, disappointed, or surprised when stuff goes bad. By contrast, every time we show how a better society can be built, we redraw the boundaries of what's possible. And we show that the realm of choice available to us is much larger than we think, and that may include paths that lead to the end of disease, or war, or fossil fuels.
Remember, none of this needs to be naive. We can understand that people are fallible, that they're self-motivated, and that they're often mistaken about their own best interests. We can recognize the massive differentials in power and wealth in our society. And we can be clear-headed about the difficulty of opposing those whose wealth is tied to planetary destruction and the misery of others.
We can anticipate setbacks and failures, disappointments and betrayals. We can expect corruption and demand transparency. And we can freely admit the profound difficulty of the tasks that lay ahead of us, and even the possibility of total failure.
But we can also believe that our best hope lies in an intelligent and courageous optimism. One that's willing to confront the business people and the politicians and the cynics that tell us that the world cannot change.
Science and technology and human ingenuity give us many of the tools that we need, and we've shown you some here today. They give us intelligent reason to believe that action is possible, that there are better solutions available, and that a better future can be built. And the common belief in a better future is the strongest glue there is. It creates the opportunity for us to love and respect one another. And that is an explosive force in business, culture, and in life. Thank you.
Major breakthrough in the fight against cancer. We're very excited about this. In a clinical trial, patients...
Sub-Saharan Africa appears to be on the verge of eradicating polio. It's been a year since the last recorded case.
The energy from these turbines have added 1 million more Ethiopians to the national grid.
You believe that we should be going to Mars? Is this a good idea?
I don't see why not.
Authorities claim that the poverty rate has dropped to 27.
2030, the end of absolute chronic poverty is what we are looking at.
The species' steady increase in numbers has been attributed to legislation.
As you can see, my legs are bionic.
In the centre of Dublin,
it was obvious what a yes vote meant to them.
A disease that once blighted 3.5 million people worldwide could soon be eradicated completely.
Solar freaking road.
And liftoff of the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket.
It's so beautiful. World leaders shocked doubters by agreeing on a plan to combat global warming.
These actions are just the beginning.
Through science, we can tackle some of the biggest challenges that we face.
Let's embrace the process of science for a better tomorrow for all of us.